What is Plato's Parmenides? It is a critique of the theory of forms and the subsequent attempt to save this theory through a specific method. The theory of forms has as its central concept presented by Socrates in the Platonic dialogues, such as Phaedo, Republic, and Symposium, postulates the existence of abstract, perfect, and immutable entities called forms. Each quality that we perceive in the sensible world, beauty, greatness, justice, has a corresponding form in the intelligible world. Explanation of properties. Things in the sensible world have the properties they have because they participate or share these forms. For example, a flower is beautiful because it participates in the form of beauty. Separation of forms. Forms are separate from sensible things, that is, they are not identical to it. The form of beauty is not the same thing as a beautiful flower, but rather the perfect archetype of beauty from which beautiful things derive beauty. The problem of participation. In the dialogue, Parmenides focuses on examining the nature of the relationship of participation between sensible things and forms. Plato considers two main explanations. The first is the pi model, that is, participating is like having a part of the form inside the sensible thing. The second is the paradigmatic model, that is, participating is like resembling the form. The inconsistencies. In the first part of the dialogue, Plato, through the character Parmenides, presents arguments that demonstrate that both explanations of the participation lead to logical inconsistencies within the theory of forms itself, which calls into questions the validity of the theory. Plato introduces a training method with the aim of saving the forms. This method consists of a series of 8 deductions, with an appendix for the first 2. I will not describe this method here. I hope you understand that it is a simple video. The deductions explore the logical consequences that can be derived both from the postulation of being and a specific form, and from the postulation of the non-being of that same form. In other words, the method investigates the implications of assuming that a form exists and the implications of assuming that it does not exist. The Parmenides is a complex dialogue that questions the theory of forms, one of the central doctrines of Platonic philosophy. By presenting criticisms and then proposing a new method of investigation, Plato demonstrates the dialectical nature of his thought, revising and deepening his own ideas. The dialogue does not necessarily abandon the theory of forms, but rather subjects it to rigorous examination, seeking a more precise and consistent understanding.
Plato mentions Parmenides in one of his dialogues, called Parmenides, where he explores and debates Parmenides' own ideas. In this dialogue, Plato presents a fictional meeting between Parmenides and Socrates, which was a common technique for Plato to explore and question different philosophies. Therefore, while Parmenides is a real person, his ideas are discussed and developed by Plato in a literary manner. Parmenides had a rather radical view of the nature of reality. He argued that reality is unique, unchanging, and eternal. According to Parmenides, that which is being has always been and will always be, without change, generation, or destruction. The immutability of being and the illusion of the senses that Parmenides proposed were in fact important influences on many subsequent philosophical movements. Philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle built on these ideas, each with their own interpretations and criticisms. Plato, for example, developed the theory of forms, which proposes an immutable and eternal reality beyond the sensible world. For Parmenides, being is and non-being is not. Parmenides believed that being is the only thing that exists. Non-being cannot exist because it has no substance of reality. The immutability of being, for Parmenides, any change, movement, or multiplicity is an illusion of the senses. He argued that our senses deceive us by making us believe that the world is constantly changing. Through the use of reason, we can perceive the true nature of being, which is constant and immutable. The oneness of being. Parmenides believed that there is only one indivisible and continuous being. Any perception of multiplicity is false. These ideas contrast sharply with the view of Heraclitus, who believed that everything is in constant change and flux. The introductory section and the narrative framework. Cephalus as narrator. The dialogue is narrated by Cephalus, who hears the story from Antiphon, who in turn heard it from Polydorus. This third-hand structure reinforces the idea that the meeting between Parmenides and Socrates is a Platonic recreation, not a literal historical account. It allows Plato to explore complex philosophical concepts through a fictional setting. The visit, Parmenides and Zeno, renowned Eleatic philosophers, visited Athens during the Great Panathenea. Their presence attracts the young Socrates and his companions, setting the stage philosophical.
The dialogue. Zeno and his book In the House of Pythagoras, defending Parmenides' monist doctrine, that is, the idea that being is one, against those who argued that this view lead to absurdities and contradictions. Zeno's argument and its relationship with the theory of forms. Characterized by reduction ad absurdum. It aims to demonstrate the logical contradictions that arise from the assumption of the plurality of things. The example given is if the things that exist are many, then they are both similar and different. Zeno argues that this leads to a contradiction because how can something be both similar and different? The connection with the theory of forms. Zeno's criticism of plurality becomes relevant to the theory of forms because it postulates the existence of multiple forms, which could be interpreted as a form of plurality. Socrates' response to Zeno, which introduces the distinction between the world of forms, seeks to resolve this apparent contradiction. Socrates argues that the same thing can participate in multiple forms, and questions raised by Zeno about plurality prepare the ground for Parmenides' objections about the nature of the participations of sensible things in forms. The famous arguments of the third man, presented by Parmenides against the theory of forms, questions the relation of participation, showing that it leads to an infinite regress. If a name and the form of man are similar and so on ad infinitum, Parmenides explore the logical consequences of the hypothesis of the one, that is, both if it exists and if it does not exist. These deductions are complex and have been the subject of debate and interpretation throughout time in the history of philosophy. Parmenides does not aim to abandon the theory of forms altogether, but rather to subject it to rigorous examination in order to refine and strengthen it. Zeno's arguments set the context for the central presentation of Zeno's ideas, prepare the reader for complex questions raised by Parmenides, which challenge the foundations of Platonic metaphysics.
Socrates' argument and his response to Zeno's paradox. Separation of forms. The theory of forms postulates that the properties we observe in the sensible world exist as independent and perfect entities in the intelligible world, that is the world of forms. Sensible things participates in these forms, which explains why they exhibit the properties they do. For example, two things are similar because they both participate in the form of similarity. Zeno argues that things are multiple, so they must be simultaneously similar and different, which seems to violate the principle of non-contradiction. Socrates' response, S. Impurity of sensible things. Socrates responds by distinguishing between the sensible world and the world of forms. He argues that sensible things can participate in multiple forms and therefore exhibit contrary properties without generating a true contradiction. This capacity of sensible things to possess contrary properties is what the analysis of the dialogue calls S. Impurity. Let's see and understand. Socrates may be similar to Plato in that they are both philosophers, participating in the form of philosophy, but different from Meletus in that Socrates is not a poet, whereas Meletus is a poet. The key to this understanding is that similarity and difference are considered in relation to different aspects or criteria. Similarly, Simmias may be tall in comparison to Socrates, but short in comparison to Phaedo. The properties of tall and short are relative to different points of reference. One and many. Socrates is an individual but also many in relation to his constituent parts. Unity and multiplicity are considered at different levels of analysis. S. Impurity does not violate the principle of non-contradiction because the properties are not attributed to the same object in the same aspect at the same time. Simmias is not simultaneously one and many at the same level of analysis. Purity of forms, the S. Impurity of sensible with the purity of forms. Socrates argues that it would be surprising if the forms themselves exhibited contrary properties. The form of beauty cannot be simultaneously beautiful and not beautiful, for this would contradict its own nature. Forms are understood as perfect and immutable entities, free from the contradictions and relativity that characterize the sensible world.
Analogy. For better understanding, we can use an analogy to illustrate this distinction. Imagine a perfect circle drawn in a commuter program. This represents the form of the circle that is perfectly round without any imperfections. Now imagine several circles drawn by hand on a piece of paper. These circles represent the sensible instance of circles. They can be more or less round, have small imperfections, etc. A hand-drawn circle can be rounder than another, but still not be more perfect than the digital circle. S impurity would apply to hand-drawn circles, which can have different degrees of roundness, while purity would apply to the perfect digital circle. In short, Socrates' reply to Zeno is based on the crucial distinction between the sensible world and the world of forms. The S impurity of the sensible allows them to exhibit contrary properties without violating the principle of non-contradiction, since these properties are always relative to different aspects or points of reference. The forms, on the other hand, remain pure and immutable, free from these contradictions. This distinction is fundamental to the theory of forms and to the understanding of Platonic philosophy. I now present a general summary in 10 points. First, the context of the dialogue. The Parmenides is in Platonic dialogue presents a critique of the theory of forms, one of the central doctrines of Plato's philosophy. The dialogue takes place during a visit by Parmenides and Zeno to Athens. Second point, the third-hand narrative. The dialogue is narrated by Cephalus, who hears the story from Antiphon, who heard it from Pythagoras. This narrative structure reinforces fictional nature of the encounter and allows Plato to explore complex concepts. Third, Zeno's argument. Zeno presents arguments to defend Parmenides' monist doctrine, being as one, demonstrating the logical contradictions that arise from the assumption of the plurality of things. Fourth, the summary of Zeno's argument. Things are many, they are similar if different. Nothing can be the same and different at the same time. Therefore things are not many. The theory of forms. The theory of forms postulates the existence of abstract, perfect and immutable entities, the forms, which serve as models for the properties that we observe in the sensible world. Sensible things participate in the forms. Socrates' response. S impurity. In order to respond to the apparent contradiction raised by Zeno, Socrates introduces the idea that sensible things are impure. That is, they can participate in multiple forms and, therefore, exhibit contrary properties without generating a true contradiction. Example of S impurity, such as Simmias being tall in relation to Socrates and short in relation to Phaedo, or Socrates being similar to Plato in being a philosopher and different from Miletus in being a poet, illustrate how sensible things can possess contrary properties in different aspects. Distinction between sensible and forms. The key to Socrates' answer is distinction between the sensible world characterized by impurity S, and the world of forms characterized by purity. Forms cannot exhibit contrary properties, for this would contradict their own perfect and immutable nature. Zeno's goal. Zeno did seek to directly prove monism, but rather to defend Parmenides, showing that the assumption of plurality led to logical contradiction. The relevance for the theory of forms. Zeno's argument and Socrates' answer raise important questions about the nature of the participation of sensible things in forms and about the internal consistency of the theory of forms itself. Parmenides subjects the theory forms to rigorous examination, seeking to refine and strengthen it and not necessarily abandon it. And if you have come this far, my thanks for watching the content. Consider subscribing to the channel, comment on the subject, leave your opinion, is very important, share the video. Forms cannot exhibit contrary properties, for this would contradict their